And welcome to the webinar, Developing Affordable Housing in High Opportunity Suburbs. My name is Buzz Roberts. I'm President and CEO of NAAHL, the National Association of Affordable Housing Lenders. NAAHL is a national alliance of major banks, community development financial institutions, housing finance agencies, and others committed to affordable housing and inclusive neighborhood revitalization. I want to thank our sponsors for these webinars. We have 27 in total with PNC Bank as our lead sponsor. And I want to thank all of them, and particularly PNC. This is the fourth webinar in our series on financing racial equity. The first engaged the perspectives of 4 national CDFI leaders. In the second webinar, Michael Eric Dyson, a best-selling writer on racial justice, was interviewed by Elena McCargo, a new member of HUD's leadership team. And in the third webinar, we learned how mortgage lenders have teamed up to build minority home ownership. You can watch these webinars on our website, NAAHL.org. We will also post today's webinar on our website in the next week or two. Today, we are focusing on creating affordable housing in high opportunity suburbs. Racial equity for affordable housing requires a balanced approach that expands choices for people of color in both suburbs with good schools and other opportunities, as well as in low-income city neighborhoods undergoing revitalization. Suburbs today are much more complex and diverse than is sometimes characterized in the media. The majority of every major racial and ethnic group now lives in the suburbs, and nearly half of all suburban renters are cost burdened. But they don't all live in the same suburbs. And as Elizabeth Kneebone of Brookings and Berkeley's Turner Center writes, that sorting did not happen organically. It's the product of exclusionary zoning and land use regulations, as well as arduous development processes. On today's webinar, we want to explore how developing affordable housing in the suburbs works in practice and how it relates to racial equity. And we have speakers from 2 nonprofit housing developers with extensive suburban experience and a real commitment to racial equity. And I might add, I know these people very well. I've worked closely with them, and they're really, as you will find, not only experienced, but really thoughtful and strategic in the work that they do. Before I introduce them, though, I want to note that we will have time, hopefully, for some Q&A toward the end of the hour. Go ahead, and if you have questions to ask, put them in the Q&A, and we'll try to deal with them throughout the webinar as they fit into what we're discussing. And as I say, we hope to have time for a few final ones at the end. So now I'd like to introduce our speakers. Nina Janapal, who's the retiring president and CEO of the Arlington Partnership for Affordable Housing. Carmen Romero, the incoming president and CEO of the Arlington Partnership for Affordable Housing. And Paul Williams, president and CEO of Project for Pride and Living in the Twin Cities area of Minnesota. Let's get started. First, can you all describe your organizations briefly? Just give us an idea. Where do you do your work? What kinds of suburbs you work in? What's the profile of the renters you serve? Just give us a little bit of orientation for your work. Nina, do you want to start?
Sure, thank you. And thank you, Buzz, for inviting us to join you today in this webinar. What an important topic. I work with the Arlington Partnership for Affordable Housing. We call ourselves APA. We're about a 30-year organization based in Arlington, Virginia. We, for 28 of those years, worked exclusively in Arlington, but for the last few years have been working throughout the DMV, the metro area of Washington. We have 2,000 units today and another 750 in development or construction. We serve about 5,000 residents in those 2,000 apartments. We are based in this community of Arlington, and I'll let my illustrious colleague Carmen, who soon will be CEO, talk a little bit more about Arlington and its demographics. I do want to say that in addition to serving families, about 10% of our households are in permanent supportive housing, people that come out of homelessness or have other special needs, and another 10% are in our mixed age populations, but they are seniors. And that was made more clear to us during COVID, their significant needs. But that's a little bit of an introduction into, and I've been at APA for 14 years and retiring at the end of June to let Carmen lead us on.
Thank you, Nina, and thank you, Buzz, for the invitation. So as Nina mentioned, most of our history has been based here in Arlington County, and a few years ago we expanded to other jurisdictions and other suburbs in Northern Virginia. But to give you kind of a flavor for the market, we work in Arlington County. It's the smallest county in America, 26 square miles. Folks probably know it as Amazon HQ2's headquarters site. 238 cities competed for it nationally, but they picked Arlington. And really the impacts are incredible. I just looked up today, the first quarter single family home values in Arlington increased 14% since last year. And the average single family home is valued at 1.3 million. That's the context in which we're trying to create affordable housing. And you know, about not only 10% of our housing stock is now left to be affordable. We've lost most of our affordable housing, the market rate affordable, over the course of, you know, since the year 2000, and it's only getting harder and harder. So a lot of the work that APA does is about creating new housing, new construction to try to replace what we're losing. And you'll hear more about our strategies to do that, and certainly looking forward to the conversation today.
Great. Paul?
Great, thanks, Buzz, and great to be here with you all, and honored to be sharing a bit about our work around this topic. Project for Pride Living (PPL) is a long-time, larger community development organization founded about 50 years ago. We work throughout the Twin Cities region, primarily in inner city core neighborhoods of Minneapolis and St. Paul, which are right together for those of you who know St. Paul and Minneapolis, but also probably in the last 15 plus years have expanded to do more new development work out in suburban areas. We've got about 1,600 units of housing. About half of that is supportive housing of various kinds, a kind of deeper service model along with the housing itself. About 3,500 folks live with us every night, and a good portion of those are kids, actually. PPL actually is a little bit more of a comprehensive community development organization, so we do combination of housing. We are a big workforce development trainer as well. And we do that in the context of race and place. And so we've really called out equity as kind of one of the core pillars of how we do the work of housing development, workforce development. We run 2 alternative high schools and kind of have a strong youth employment and education program as well. But housing clearly has been the body of work that has been at the center of our work. The place-based strategy, while we aren't specific to a particular neighborhood, we have deeper engagements over the years in a variety of neighborhoods, again, particularly in the core, and our work out in the suburbs has been more specifically kind of specific project-based. So we don't have the same place-based strategy in the suburban communities that we're developing housing in. Our suburban strategy has been all about kind of opportunity and balance. The arguments over the years around concentrated poverty and suburbs needing to do more, we decided years ago that we wanted to be kind of a both and. We wanted to be both continuing to build strong communities and revitalize the inner city, and we wanted to be active in being part of the answer to more affordable housing availability out in suburban communities. Twin Cities is a relatively strong, wealthy community. I think as many of you know from what you've seen in the last year. Our disparities in the racial gap in the Twin Cities is among the worst in the nation. People of color tend to be segregated, tend to be poorer. We have the worst disparities in terms of health outcomes, education outcomes between our white community, which is very prosperous and very strong, and our BIPOC communities really continuing to struggle and to live in more segregated areas. We don't have nearly kind of the price inflation that you see on the coasts and in DC, but in our area, affordable housing has been a pretty significant crisis. Just very low vacancy rates, well under 2 to 3%. Price inflation in terms of home ownership. I think our average home price is about $300,000 for the Twin Cities. That's a big deal, and that crisis in affordable housing has fueled real difficulties in a number of different areas, and so that's a little bit about us.
And how does race factor into your strategy as a community developer, housing developer? Start with Paul. You mentioned that it is, but give us an idea of how you do that, and then Nina and Carmen as well.
Yeah. Well, so the vast majority of people who live in our housing and come through our doors are folks of color, and I've been at PPL for about 7 years now. And when I came, the issues of demographic change, the issues of race, the issues, the arguments and policy debates around concentrated poverty were well underway and well in place already. And we felt at PPL like we just needed to acknowledge that. We needed to acknowledge that the location of affordable housing, the fights that we get into trying to develop affordable housing oftentimes have a racial dimension. They always have a racial dimension, kind of underlying the debates and the dialogue. We also strategically, particularly because we have this workforce lens as well, we really look at the strength of our communities of color has everything to do with the strength of the region. In other words, the demographic changes taking place in the population, our future workforce increasingly will be and already is folks of color. And so for us, it was about framing our strategic plan in terms of being relevant to the region. We desperately need every single person of color in our community to succeed because we need the region to succeed. If we're going to be competitive as a region, we absolutely need these communities of color to succeed. And those communities, including the community that I grew up in, right, a historically Black neighborhood in St. Paul, we need those communities to thrive. And housing, as all of us know, is one of the core elements. So race has everything to do with our strategy.
And I'm happy to jump in, and Nina can add. From APA's perspective, I think we completely agree with Paul's approach of the both and when it comes to developing affordable housing. We have the most diverse part of the county where we operate is the Columbia Pike community, where 43 languages are spoken, where you really have the majority of the low income families that live in the county historically are on that corridor. And it's also a revitalization corridor. So you have an incredible amount of redevelopment pressure. And what APA traditionally does in those cases is, as they were redeveloping the land use vision, 50-year vision for what they wanted to see happen on that corridor, we really pushed hard for a no net loss of affordable and of the diversity of that corridor. And we go into really a community by community discussion, bringing our residents to the table, making sure that they're advocating at the county board hearings and others, so that the tools are there as a new development is coming in to have inclusionary zoning included. If there's sites that are publicly owned or owned by affordable housing, put more density there to account for the fact that some of the market, the sites controlled by market rate developers can in fact be redeveloped for more affordable housing. And it's, the way but it's the and approach. There are also sections of the county, as Paul mentioned, that have no affordable housing and no diversity, where it's 97% affluent. You know, if the average, I gave you 1.3 million, that's average. There's a whole section of the county where every house is over 2.5, right? And so what we are now fighting is that corridor, the most affluent part of the county, is about to start a rezoning literally last weekend. And that's where we really need people in that community to step up and, you know, recognize that we want to be a diverse county. This is a very progressive community. So people align themselves with those values, but then a lot of times people hide behind kind of other objections, right? Transportation, impact on schools and other. And we know that narrative is often about keeping people of color out of neighborhoods. So we are really explicit about making sure that we address every concern they have. If the concern is school capacity, okay, then let's build more schools. But we're not going to use it as an excuse to prevent bringing additional density in really the most affluent parts of every corner of the communities where we need to serve.
It's been really interesting too, to find that sometimes these arguments are not data-based. So we spend a lot of time raising up the real data. Interestingly, on the Columbia Pike corridor that Carmen was referencing, some of the school children there, children of color and low income, free and reduced lunch, have the highest test scores for children of color in the county. Because they're getting extra services, the schools are attuned to their needs, they have extra programs, after school enrichment, and the families are finding stability there. So sometimes there's a little bit of a myth that, you know, all the opportunity is by going to the high opportunity neighborhoods, when in fact a rich community should be putting, as Paul has said, you know, both and money into these neighborhoods that have been disadvantaged and that are predominantly multifamily. I think the other thing that's changing on our racial lens is being more thoughtful and explicit about this. So in the 2010 census, Arlington and Washington, D.C. were the two jurisdictions in Metro D.C. that had a reduced people of color, reduced African-American and Hispanic populations, and the outer suburbs got more. So there's this dynamic going on where the outer suburbs, which traditionally didn't have a lot of diversity, are finding themselves with that, and they don't have the services and the coalitions and the resources. So APA is being drawn into places like Loudoun County near Dulles Airport, where there's an interesting coalition of human services leaders that say, we need affordable housing, we need these anchors in our community, but we also are talking to the Chamber of Commerce that says we need more workers in this community. We just keep building more single family homes, and we can't find workers for our retail work, our construction work, our other positions, because none of the housing is affordable to those wage earners. So really that issue of where the jobs are, where do your jobs sleep at night, I thought was one of the greatest lines they had. And that means more people of color in these outer suburbs, because you have to recognize that that's where our economics are. $1 million is a barrier for many people of color to enter into a community.
I assume part of that migration out, if it is migration, is because of affordability, right? Or people are getting driven out of the higher cost inner suburbs.
As they say, drive till you qualify. So yes, less expensive rental properties, less expensive home ownership opportunities. Sprawl is part of what helps people to afford to stay in our communities. Gentrification of our inner city it's an exciting thing. We're getting more diverse. DC's becoming, as they call it, the cappuccino city. So there's some good things about that, the money and wealth and resources that it's bringing into DC neighborhoods. But where are those people going who are being forced out?
So what is the civic conversation like around affordable housing and race where you guys work?
I'll just, I want to come back to that last point, because that's actually really interesting, the conversation around gentrification and kind of location but the civic dialogue, and again here in the Twin Cities, it has been so elevated, here in the last year for sure. But I mean, we knew we had a problem around race and kind of concentrated issues, kind of concentrated communities of color in the core well before the last year. And that conversation has the civic conversation has been more of a, let's keep that off to the side. Yeah, it's important, but to Nina's point, what I think has begun to change in the civic conversation around race, again, is this recognition around workforce. And we need workers, and a recognition that the workforce is changing, and that we need to figure out how to bring workers of color to these jobs, and that location and siting of affordable housing. And it's not just affordable housing, for the lowest income folks. It really is workforce housing as well. It's meat and potatoes folks. Who's going to take that semi-technical job, in that third ring suburb, operating a pretty sophisticated machine, in an assembly plant, that pays, $50,000 or $60,000. That's a worker bee. That's a working family. And how do we kind of create that? So I think the civic discourse around this has been changing from what I call a purely poverty-focused discussion, right? How do we help those people, and how do we kind of manage the problem, to one of, man, it turns out these folks, these communities are part and parcel of the answer, right, to our broader economic question. So I'm hopeful about that. I see that as a positive sign, but it has been a rough up and down journey getting there. And I think that journey and that discourse amongst businesses and in the chambers of commerce and so forth is still a little bit disconnected from the siting conversation, when we actually go to try and get something built in that community on that site and start going through the city council process and so forth.
I guess I would echo that and say I've seen over my 10 years at APA an incredible change in the allies that we have in the fight for affordable housing. Initially it was really just us and some nonprofits, maybe the faith community. But now more and more we have the bids creating housing subgroups within their business improvement districts, knowing that they need to be supportive of affordable housing in Tyson's Corner and others, as they have big corporate anchors coming in. It's folks like George Mason University who's really leaned into APA and our mission of affordable housing to help, how do we have a cradle to career pathway for our residents? So you have George Mason, who's trying to do kits to get our kids interested in STEM from the age of 5 and up, because they realize that is the pathway, Paul, to your saying, we need workers to have all these big corporate companies want to stay in Northern Virginia, because if people are priced out, they're going to move their companies to North Carolina or to other parts of the country. And these universities are more and more realizing that it's really our residents, especially the second generation residents. APA's got, out of the 5,000 folks that live in our homes, around 1,500 of them are under the age of 25. And that is an incredible opportunity for these, robust partnerships. And, it really drives a lot of, kind of our vision around, wealth inequality in this country and what can be done in affordable housing, really invest in that second generation that lives in our buildings to help be part of how we might change some of the, racial disparity that's really underlying a lot of the issues we have in the country today.
And on your topics, particularly, Buzz, of asking how is race showing up in the public sphere, we had a pretty important zoning hearing for us about 3 weeks ago. And it was fascinating to me because the same topics you hear a lot of, we want to protect our single family neighborhoods. We want to protect the community culture, the environment, their quiet space, all of a sudden is being peppered by people who are saying, well, wait, weren't those single family neighborhoods, which are 85% of Arlington County, created under a racist plan? Oh, and look at that Arlington article we just had that mentioned that Arlington was 39% African-American in 2000, and it's now 9%. And that was the result of deliberate discriminatory policies. Maybe we should be thinking about this zoning question differently. And as those comments bubble up to the elected officials, it's really creating a different conversation. And I will say, to give a shout out to Paul, kind of alluded to this, Minneapolis 2040 has really been cited and as a case example of talking about race as a way to rethink zoning. Bring that conversation first. And we're seeing it work. We're seeing people a little embarrassed about that overemphasis on protecting our single family neighborhoods, recognizing that really painful and racist history of those communities.
Well, do you want to say a word about Minneapolis 2040 and what is that anyway, and how does it connect in here?
I'm not an expert on the plan, and I mean, but it has been a major rethink of the city's comprehensive plan, and particularly kind of a shift away from the historic single family, kind of zoning, neighborhoods zoned only for, a single family home on that lot. I think they've opened it up now to up to three units on a single lot, which creates the possibility. I think we are still early in that process of actually seeing what's going to get built. We're seeing a little bit of new activity, and again, the pandemic kind of slowed everything down, although the market is kind of roaring back here in terms of real estate. But it's still, I think, too early to tell, but it creates the possibility to have higher density housing in traditionally single family neighborhoods. The question is, can you make it pencil out in terms of adding units on those in those, and there's some worry about the only places where it's going to pencil out is actually in lower income neighborhoods, and that it'll still take a long time to get increased density in the more affluent neighborhoods of the city. But again, very early on, and a lot of people worked really hard to make that push and to see that change happen. We're excited about it.
So how big a problem is NIMBY these days for you folks? And how do you deal with it? Have you had any deals fail to happen because of NIMBY problems, or are you able to navigate around them, near misses perhaps?
I'll start out. We're just coming off of one. I wouldn't call it a failure, but first ring suburb, progressive first ring suburb, good school system, kind of middle income suburb, right on one of the new light rail lines that's being built in the Twin Cities. The site, we work with a church. Churches are some of our most important partners and greatest opportunities. Church that, their congregation was declining. They wanted to do the right thing with their land. Approached us about buying it, redeveloping it, and purchasing the site. And the resistance there around traffic, around density and too many people, kind of the occasional murmur about who's exactly coming out here or who you're going to bring out here, crime, and over the course of a year plus of working with that municipality and through that the zoning process and so forth, we got dumbed down. It's what I call dumbed down. We started with a 120 unit project down to 100, down to about 80, down to about 60. And I think right now we're somewhere between 50 and 60. 2 blocks from a planned light rail station, right? So the walkability scores for this project were off the charts. Fantastic site. You're not tearing anything out, right? You're building on a church site. So private development of much higher density, market rate luxury rental project had been built on another part of the community that sailed through, just fine. But that affordable project, just got gradually beaten down and lowered down and lowered down. So it'll be a good project. We're grateful for the partnership, but that process, we run into that, I think, time and time again. where the site and the need is much, much greater, right? And this is largely workforce housing. So this is, for 60%, median income, tax credit project, family of four earning, about $50,000 a year. But boy, that resistance and the subtleties of that resistance, pretty profound.
Nina, do you want to start?
Well, I want to just tell a historic story first, and you can kind of pick it up more currently. But 2007, we had a project with a church, and Paul just reminded me of this, that had 7 lawsuits. And it was millions of dollars of delay. It was literally, there were yard signs in every home. And the brilliance to me of the county leadership was they said, push it ahead and make it happen. Figure out these lawsuits. We're behind you. It's the same thing. It was a stone's throw from a metro station. And I believe that that actually set a precedent that was good for the community. And people looked at that and they said, well, we could organize and fight and fight and fight and spend $100,000 of our personal money fighting these and still lose. And so I think the courage that those elected officials had to set that precedent really helped us with the projects that came after. And we could take people on tours of that property, and neighbors would even be quoted as saying, I thought it would be worse than it was. I didn't know it would be such a nice, attractive neighbor. So I do think that making those bold decisions, supporting our elected officials. We've also worked with churches as advocates. We've also worked with our own residents as advocates. They're an important voice to have at the table. Elected officials say to us all the time, bring your residents to this hearing, have them advocate for themselves, because it's a lot harder when they're not even in the room, right? It's easy to talk about othering, right? But if they're in the room, it's hard to say, oh, I don't want you in my neighborhood. And Carmen, you probably have more current stories about our NIMBY deal.
Yeah, and I guess it all, to me, starts and ends with political will. We've been very fortunate, at least in Arlington in the last decade. We've not had a single deal since I arrived that has had a single no on the county board. It's been unanimous every time. And trust me, there's a lot of contention, 200 questions. Typically, at the fastest project we can get in the ground is 3 years, but it's gone as long as 7 years. Because it's a very retail process. You've got to go to people's living rooms. You've got to go out on the weekends. You've got to stay there until 2 o'clock in the morning, midnight. Talking to them, bringing more people into the conversation and just bringing more and more voices, has really helped us make sure that it's not just a single family homeowners dominating the civic process, that we are making sure that more voices are being heard, not just of, our residents, we bring them to the table, but people who've been pushed out of Arlington, people who work in Arlington, and that would benefit from the housing. And as Dina mentioned, when we take them to see our properties, these are beautiful buildings that don't look any different than any of the market rate buildings that are being developed. And that really does tend to help. I think people have this image of what affordable housing is going to do to their property values. And we have police officers that live in our buildings. We offer a free unit to Arlington County Police to move into one of our buildings. And it's a win-win. Right when we're talking about a time when there's so much angst between, police and law enforcement and populations of color, to have, a member of the, of the police force living in these buildings, being part of the community, being there at the cookouts. I think that's the message that we're trying to put forward in the communities we serve.
Buzz, I just wanted to add to that, just the importance of that. You used a great word, that it's a very retail process, and that's absolutely right. And we have used those same tours of other buildings in order to really just let people know what this looks like, and especially policymakers to see and to really kind of strengthen their resolve. And I do think it is a question of kind of political will. We've had a major automotive, the Ford Motor Company left a auto plant in St. Paul, kind of in the urban core, and the voices, the organizing of voices and residents and folks in the neighborhood to say, we want this density. So it's not just pushing back against the resistance, it's also about generating the support. Folks said, I want to live in this neighborhood, close to the Mississippi River, close to job job opportunities in a wonderfully affluent neighborhood. I deserve to live here, and we deserve to live here. So it's just an interesting part of that dynamic.
I noticed there's something in the chat question that is a little relevant to this too. There was some pressure in our community. Carmen mentioned the main place our home base is Arlington, and it's a small county, the smallest in the US. And there was some pressure by the opponents to limit occupancy in our buildings to only people that lived or worked in Arlington. And we interpreted that, frankly, as racist. The neighbors next door to us, Washington, D.C., Alexandria, Virginia, Prince George's County, have a higher percentage of African Americans. And we said, we're going to be sued. We're going to be sued for fair housing violations if we do that. So I think that's a really interesting question. And I have heard of that as a kind of a suburban response. Well, okay, if I'm going to invest in affordable housing, let me only let my people come into it. But I do think we actually consciously try and recruit across different communities. In our last property, we actually were reaching out to African-American churches who had a population that used to live in Arlington, maybe even generations back. They still worship there, but they've left the community to live there, and had a really positive response to say, well, we would like to come back. But limiting it to just who lives in that suburban community, there is a little NIMBY color to that, I think.
So, I mean, that brings me to a couple of related questions to this. Where do your renters come from? Are they mostly from the local community? Are they from other parts of the region, from the central city? How do they find you?
When we do a new property, we track that, and on average, about 75% come from within a 5-mile radius. So often they're coming from an overcrowded housing condition. Maybe they're doubling up with another family. They find there's an affordable home and they can settle in. A lot of our families will come having moved every year for the last 5 years. And our average turnover is people stay more than 5 years. So this is a place where they can find comfortable housing in an area that's high priced, and maybe they were not as comfortable before.
Paul, how about you?
Yeah, in our suburban developments, especially, we often find that the folks are already there. So we did one development in a second ring suburb, really wonderful community, and there were questions about, well, who's going to live here? And if you just went down the block, actually a couple blocks away, there was kind of a quiet market rate rental project just down the way from the place where we were going to be developing our project. And if you looked in the parking lot, all you saw were women in hijabs. And sure enough, in this community already was kind of this quiet, hidden, strong East African. We have a very large Somali community here in the Twin Cities, but a very strong presence of Somali folks already out in the community, and many times the folks who move into those units are folks that are already out there, and that's kind of the hidden poverty, but the hidden worker bees that already live out in suburban communities. And I think that's the changing rapidly changing demographics of suburban communities that we're seeing across the country. Certainly seeing that here in the Twin Cities.
I wanted to move on to a development question. It must be hard to acquire sites in the suburban markets that have a lot of other developers trying to build market rate housing or commercial properties. So how do you do that? How do you acquire sites?
So I'll jump in there, Buzz, and I'd say we have 4 kind of typical channels for where we get sites. A lot of it is redevelopment of our own historic sites. We own 19 properties, and we look at the portfolio and see what we can take through a change in the general land use plan. And typically we can go get 4 times what we have today. So if we're building, we'll tear down, and we've done this over and over again in our portfolio, a 20-unit building and make it 100 units. We take surface parking lots, and believe it or not, we can do a lot on 1 acre. We've built 249 units on 1 acre. We've built 160 on 1 acre. So, over and over in our portfolio, that 1 acre, depending on how many stories and how close it is to metro, we are now doing a couple of 12-story executions on 1 acre, and that translates into 250 units. So it's a pretty easy conversation to have with the county. See, if you give us density on this, we can really move the needle forward. We also go after public land. A lot of municipalities realize that land, they may not have cash, but a lot of municipalities have land. And so we are building right now in Fairfax County on an old stormwater facility off of a highway, 150 units of senior housing, which is very exciting. Fairfax is, again, that second ring of the suburbs. Arlington is the closest in, Fairfax is the next ring out. And they have a very ambitious affordable housing plan and a huge public land inventory that they can really grow at this. Faith-based land, Nina and I are, on our fourth, I think, church deal right now. And we're doing one where we're co-locating with a childcare center that's going to have 90 kids in it. So that's the exciting part of working with the faith-based community. Sometimes you do even more than just the housing. And in another church deal, we built a kitchen incubator on the ground level of that project. So you have underemployed or unemployed, mostly immigrants who could start their own businesses, culinary businesses, job training, and sometimes really those faith partners bring additional resources that you can leverage in that way. And then lastly, partnerships with for-profits. You have a lot of development going on in the DC area. You've got affordable housing requirements that are part of the land use. And a lot of times they are looking for a partner like APA where they can, for the 20-acre redevelopment, give us 3 acres so that we can take care of their affordable housing contributions. And so we are in partnership with one, for example, where they donated the site to us and we're building senior housing, but we're doing that in 3 other cases as well.
Paul, what about you?
Yeah, well, and we would love to be as proactive and strategic as you all are. We're still in a kind of in a position of having to pursue underutilized sites or crummy sites, environmentally difficult sites, that kind of thing. And suburban municipal governments are key relationships for us, which we've been building over time. So, again, we built on one site where there was a number of rundown older duplexes on pretty big parcels next to an overgrown park. We partnered with the city. The city redid the park actually and opened up what had been a covered up Waters Creek, basically. Lovely park, and we were able to relocate those residents and build a 60-unit tax credit project, again 2-3 blocks from a light rail stop, planned light rail stop. That was a wonderful project, but I mean, we really are kind of going to scope out those underutilized sites, and for us, again, as I mentioned, the other project on the church that we are working with now, churches remain really kind of key potential partners, and we also are working increasingly with private developers who are looking for a nonprofit, affordable partners on much larger developments.
And while we're on the sort of hard development kind of topic here, a question in the chat is, so are you getting financing from banks? Do they provide equity or debt for your deals, and do they get CRA credit for doing it?
In our case, yes, absolutely. We are, matter of fact, we've worked with some really much bigger banks that have come in and really wanted to do the entire project. So they did the tax credits, they did a small mortgage on the property. This was a workforce project. They did the construction financing, and I'm almost positive they got full CRA credit for that. And that was a good process. For us, it's a little bit difficult when you're that deep into it with a bigger bank, because everything's a square peg, and do you fit into it? And if you don't, they're trying to bang you into fitting into it. So that relationship was a little strained.
What about for APA?
CRA is definitely a motivator for our lenders and investors. And we're also seeing this trend in the equity markets that if the investor doesn't have a loan product, a construction loan, or construction to permanent financing, the pricing is significantly lower. So we're understanding that that's because there is this CRA motivation that comes stronger on the debt side, actually, than on the investment side. Which is too bad because the investment side is a really important piece of it. But, you know, we, as Paul says, you make your square peg fit the round hole. And if that's important to them, we try and work within those limitations to get the best pricing and the best value for these projects.
Have you found that the investor market on the equity side has softened a little bit through the pandemic or prior? Recently?
Well, we definitely saw some softening after the 4% rate got fixed. That people were telling us, you know, we have more deals than we expected. And so we're not feeling as aggressive. Our plate is full. We don't have room in our pipeline for you this year, or they're being just more selective. I don't think the pandemic was much of an issue, although we had a very rough closing after the pandemic started where there were just a lot of bells and whistles. They wanted confidence that we were going to execute on the construction and deliver on time, you know, pre-commit to the subcontractors, things that gave them reassurance about the construction timeline.
And how did that construction project work out for you guys? Were you able to maintain schedule?
Well, Carmen and I were just walking through the topping out 2 days ago, and the project manager, the project executive was saying to us, we don't tell your banker. We're grateful that we locked that in because there is a huge crisis right now in construction with the supply chain. And they have all their supplies on site and it's really keeping them on schedule. And so it worked. It was something anomalous. They weren't happy about doing it. But in this case, it really got us ahead of the curve on a really tumultuous time in the construction markets.
What are you seeing, Paul?
Yeah, well, I was just going to say, I don't think we haven't seen a significant softening in the market. I think, and I'm just trying to think of the last year. So we had one project that was under construction that finished prior to its scheduled completion and a little bit under budget even. That was last year, early in the pandemic. And funny how the price for the big parcel that we bought as in that Ford redevelopment site, 160 acres, somehow that price and that purchase wasn't at all affected by the pandemic, right? So we paid our full price as agreed. That stayed on schedule. As the year went on, I do think closings with our state finance agency, all of that got complicated and slowed down. And I think that was mostly about just working remotely and people just not being quite as efficient. And certainly here in the last several months, the construction materials, lumber prices. I mean, we're in the process right now of actually having to do an early construction start because we can't get to our closing with our partners. And so we're gonna self-finance the early construction in order to keep the project on track so that the bid prices, the lumber prices, don't go up even further than they already have. It's really a tough environment right now.
Well, you know, it's very interesting to watch the entire economy as it sort of creaks back into motion after 15 months or so of or 14 months of real contraction and stasis. And my guess is that it's like when you turn back the water in your house after it's been off for a while, you're going to get some sputtering and some air pockets in there until the water runs freely and clear. We just have about 10 minutes left. So I wanted to ask, there's so many questions to ask, but let me ask a question, Paul, you touched on earlier. How do you folks help your renters increase their economic prospects and opportunities? Is that part of how you see your role as an affordable housing nonprofit? And how do you do it, particularly in the suburbs, particularly serving residents of color?
Well, for us, not everyone who is in our housing is in our workforce training programs. It is something that we make available, and certainly we have a in our supportive housing, there is a support system and a dedicated service model that is about household stability. Isn't necessarily geared towards workforce readiness, but we're always goal setting, figuring out what is it that you need to get you to a more self-reliant place. And then we also do make all of our workforce training programs, which really are what we call career pathways. So it's different than, hey, let's just help you kind of sharpen up your resume and look for some jobs. It's more about, here are some promising career pathways with low thresholds to entry, but have a higher kind of wage and a career track possibility. So we make that available to our folks. But I would say that's an uneven process. I also think locating our housing in the right places along those transit corridors, closer to those job centers, that is part of our strategy, certainly, in our suburban development. And at the end of the day, housing is just central, as we all know, central to be able to just being able to get to the other things in life. Housing is healthcare. Housing is job training. Housing is childcare. Turns out housing is education. A bunch of us have been, right, educating our kids from home, right, for this last year. And I think a lot of that actually has really come to the fore through the pandemic.
And I'll jump in here because I think this is certainly a passion of mine as I look to the future of APA. We are very prolific real estate developer, creating affordable housing, and we know the tools to do that. But what we really need as an industry is, similar innovation and investment into the resident services. Everything Paul was just talking about, cradle to career. We need more resources for childcare, for after-school programs, for certifications, for 529 accounts for every low-income child in our portfolio. We need home ownership pathways. But right now that's unfunded. We don't have the tools to do it on a scalable way. We can do a 20-kid after-school program, but we're talking thousands, and maybe part of that is, collaborations with our public school systems, but they're so overwhelmed. They can't even get the schools open, right? So we can't wait for them to figure it out. And what I challenge banks, and you're an association of lenders, we've been in conversations with our state agency too. We need to incentivize and create lasting financial tools to ensure that this housing comes with, the funding for the services. Or, and it's a lot of it to me is about that second generation.
So as we head toward wrapping up, how do you see, where else do you see the future of your work going? Carmen, you've already touched on this a little bit. But what's your path going forward? What's your plan?
I think we, in this business, have to stop patting ourselves in the back at every ribbon cutting and groundbreaking, because that's one project. We need to talk about, scalable solutions and bringing new partners, because the local governments can't do it alone. The nonprofits can't do it alone. We need the business community to step up in a bigger way to meet the actual need of the region. And then in the region we play in, we're talking the DC region, we probably need 200,000 units of affordable housing across the 15 jurisdictions that make up the DMV. And I know you have different groups kind of calling for that too. So how do we get kind of regionalism to work with different and new stakeholders, and some of them with deep pockets?
Yeah, I would agree. I do think the relevance, again, for us, this our last strategic plan, which we're in, kind of year 4, 5-year plan, was framed around regional relevance, regional competitiveness, and positioning housing and workforce as two key elements of what this region needs to remain competitive. And so I think that is, and for us, race and place and policy. Race, place, policy are the 3 pillars of our work around housing and workforce. And so that's the way we've framed it, and we'll kind of continue to talk about that. We've been talking about race long before George Floyd was murdered here in the Twin Cities. And to Carmen's other point, I absolutely think that on the policy front, getting the private sector developers engaged in affordable housing has to be part of the answer, right? Even if you doubled what our wonderful nonprofit housing developer community does, we will never be able to produce the number of units that really are needed, right, to really solve the housing crisis, at least from the supply side here. And so how do we get this to pencil out for private developers? And ultimately, I think that does come down to density questions, land use questions, some of the regulatory questions. I wouldn't go all, some of our private developers can go well over the top in terms of changes they'd like to see. But I do think that's part of the solution.
Nina, you get the last word.
I think it's important that the lenders are here in this space with us, and particularly this last conversation, health and housing, workforce development, next generation development. So we'd love it if you all could embrace that piece. Housing is more than just a place to live.
That sounds like a great place for us to end today. I want to thank Nina, Carmen, and Paul for their wonderful insights and willingness to join us today. I also want to thank our 27 sponsors led by PNC Bank, and of course the audience. This is the last in our Financing Racial Equity series as we begin to organize for our annual Policy and Practice Conference, November 9th at the National Press Club, which will be live and in person, which we're very much looking forward to. So please keep a lookout for that on social media and our website for formal announcements and registration details. And with that, I want to thank everyone one last time and wish you all a good day.